Hi, I'm Justin with Education Elements.
And I'm Gabby Hewitt. Today, we want to talk about belonging, now more important than ever.
When I think about belonging, I think about what it looks like and what it feels like. Here in Miami, it looks like sharing a cup of coffee, specifically a colada. If you're not familiar with the colada, it's a super potent Cuban espresso that usually comes in a big styrofoam cup, and when you buy it, they give you these little teeny tiny shot glasses that you're supposed to pour the espresso into and share it with whoever's around you. A lot of times across the city, later in the afternoon, someone will show up with the colada and pour everybody around the room a little shot of this espresso. And on the surface, it just feels like a little afternoon pick-me-up. But actually, when you think about it, it's a very powerful gesture that creates a strong sense of belonging. When you're served that shot of espresso, it's actually creating belonging on a few different levels. You belong to that moment, you're connected to the person who served it to you, and you belong with that group that you're taking time out of your day with to enjoy the coffee.
Traditionally, in schools and in classrooms across the country, belonging might look like grabbing a colada or a coffee together, but it might also look like eating lunch together, attending meetings together, problem solving together. In an increasingly hybrid or remote work environment, it's harder to replicate a sense of belonging using traditional tactics that weren't always 100% effective.
In March of this year, many teachers found themselves in situations like this, alone, teaching from an empty classroom or from home. Many other teachers were, and still are, juggling caring for their own children at home while supporting their students from a distance. Teachers were, and are continuing to navigate ambiguity and complexity, figuring out how to stay healthy and safe and care for themselves while supporting their students from a distance, either through virtual learning or socially. We have heard teachers describe the past 8 months as traumatic, stressful, and confusing. And overwhelmingly, we've heard teachers share feelings of being disconnected, feeling like they no longer belong to a part of a school community, or that they're figuring out what that belonging looks like.
Belonging is a basic human need, one that we've always known about as educators, but now is more important to prioritize than ever, and prioritize with intention. New constraints like social distancing, distance learning, and hybrid models have disrupted how we traditionally create a sense of belonging. Teacher retention remains a challenge, and it's only been worsened by the pandemic. In a recent poll, 28% of teachers reported that they are more likely to retire or leave the profession, a profession that was already struggling to retain educators prior. For teachers of color, a sense of belonging or lack thereof has historically been a common experience, and it is worse now. Scholar and Vice Provost of Stanford's Diversity and First Gen Office, Jericka Blackman, says this about belonging and how it's uniquely tied to our efforts towards a more diverse work environment. She says, diversity is a fact, inclusion is a strategy, belonging is a measure, and equity is the goal. So what can we do? We need to prioritize how we create a sense of belonging with and for teachers, and we can't afford to leave it to chance. How do we get there? The Stanford Design School has put out 4 dimensions that collectively create a culture of belonging. The first dimension is invitation and welcoming. The second dimension is knowing and accepting. The third is participating and contributing. And finally, all of this leads to the 4th dimension, which is personal growth. Not only do each of these dimensions give us something very unique, but collectively, they can create a powerful culture of belonging for your teachers and your staff. For example, that first dimension on invitation and welcoming gives your teachers and educators an initial sense of belonging. That second dimension of knowing and accepting, we see frequently come up in a manager-managee relationship. So you as a principal or as a school or team leader might be able to provide this for your teachers. The third dimension of participating and contributing gives your employees and your teachers a sense of respect and a feeling that they are valued. And that final dimension of personal growth gives your teachers personal connections with other members of the team. Responsive organizations have been working on creating this culture of belonging using these dimensions that Stanford has put out, and we can learn something about how to replicate these in the school and classroom environment. For example, Airbnb focuses on all 4 of these dimensions. When someone is newly hired to their team, they intentionally invite them to all sorts of team meetings and are active in their hospitality efforts. This is an extreme focus on that first dimension of invitation and welcoming. Airbnb managers also make it a point to ask their new hires, what's your why? What's your passion for being here? And they are active in contributing new projects with what they know about their employees' why. This will help your school culture move into that second dimension of belonging, of knowing and accepting. Airbnb also offers authentic opportunities for their employees to engage in solving problems and offering ideas. And not only are they intentional about creating authentic engagement, they are transparent even if that engagement leads to critical or adjusting feedback. This is essential to giving your teachers that sense of respect and feeling of value that is so common in that third dimension of belonging, participating and contributing. And finally, Airbnb team members know that when they contribute, not only does it contribute to the growth of the entire team, but it also fosters personal growth in themselves. When your teachers feel that their contributions make your school and your district a better place, but they also feel like they're growing professionally, you've moved into that final phase of belonging, creating personal growth.
If we can design and adopt intentional experiences and practices that create a strong sense of belonging, then teachers will feel valued and they'll bring their whole selves to the classroom. This means we have to select and design practices that are powerful and effective and flexible across a range of scenarios, whether in person, hybrid, or distance learning. It's much easier to create a sense of belonging when there's a shared understanding of what it looks like and what it feels like. Take time to define this and think about exactly what it looks like and what it feels like in your school community. Work with a broad range of teachers and stakeholders and sit down and get this on paper. A simple way to start is by using your 5 senses and asking teachers, what does belonging sound like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it look like? From there, you can reflect on practices and systems that you already have in place that might already be furthering belonging. And it might also help expose the things that are happening in your school that are preventing belonging from happening for teachers.
Another focus area to think about is reflecting on your people. Once a month, sit down with your leadership team with the sole purpose to check in on your teachers. If you aren't checking in on your teachers and their sense of belonging, then who is? One strategy you can try is one by one reflect on each individual teacher and their current sense of belonging by asking the following questions. Are your teachers being invited to conversations where decisions are being made? Do they feel like they have an ability to contribute and for those contributions to be seen and valued? Do they have a core group of colleagues that they can rely on for personal and professional support? If you can't answer all of these questions for your teachers, that's okay. The goal of the meeting is to walk out with a list of teachers that you plan to check in with one-on-one, not to coach or to review data, but to empathize and to gain a greater understanding of their current reality.
Another approach you can try is to ask teachers to share their personal stories, why they teach, and what motivates them to do so. As a leader, you can start by modeling this yourself. Think of it like a TED Talk about your personal journey, what led you to education, and what keeps you going. You might share your why story at a staff meeting, whether in person or through Zoom. Or you might start off with a smaller group, like just your leadership team, and then practice it with a small group of teachers. Sharing personal stories helps teachers to better understand you and each other. It exposes connections and common experiences and interests that teachers might not have known they shared with other people in the building. These stories can be the foundation for future conversations and the building of relationships that really help to increase belonging at the school. Teachers stay when they feel empowered to bring their whole selves to the classroom and to the school. This happens through the intentional design of systems and practices that invite teachers in and let them be themselves and bring their whole selves to school. Defining what belonging looks like, regularly checking in on teachers, and sharing your personal why stories can all help move you in the right direction. We hope you're walking away with a greater sense of why it's important to create a belonging environment and what it looks like to do this, whether in person or at a distance.
Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm an associate partner with Education Elements. Today, I'm going to be talking about the need to reassess and redefine teacher competencies within the new normal of education. We are living in a time that has changed the way we work and live. Across every industry, the fundamental knowledge, skills, and mindsets required of our employees underwent a transformation overnight as we grappled with a global pandemic. For me, this meant learning how to set up and break down an office in my kitchen, learning how to engage both small groups and large groups in a virtual setting, and how to become more fluent with video software and conferencing. I've even had to relearn daily work and home life routines, like what to wear to work, or the importance of keeping my couch a place for rest and relaxation versus emails. And while the pandemic forced our hands, many of the workforce adjustments we see today were already on our radar. The World Economic Forum, a full year ahead of the pandemic, predicted that by 2022, 42% of our core skills would be expected to change due to automation, artificial intelligence, and shifts to virtual or remote systems, and that 54% of our global workforce would need to be reskilled or upskilled to make these changes. In this sense, the pandemic didn't change our path. It merely accelerated it. And the longer we live and operate in a state of social distancing and virtual work, the more likely the changes we have put in place will become permanent transformations to the workplace. Our education system faces a monumental task of assessing these changes and conducting a comprehensive overhaul of the traditional competencies of our teacher workforce. Shifts to virtual, hybrid, and concurrent teaching models require us to consider enhancements to existing competencies, known as upskills, and learning entirely new ones, known as reskills. The medical industry provides a great example of these types of shifts. Doctors who have been upskilled to treat patients virtually, or airline workers who have been reskilled as nurses in those same hospitals. In the classroom, we're seeing a wide range of each, both skills that need translation in a new setting and entirely new skill sets. So where do we even start? We recommend that you take time to audit your top teacher competencies. What competencies might need to be upskilled, enhanced, or redefined? And what new competencies might need reskilling, which are entirely new or previously held by a different role? Areas like classroom management or instructional design might be shoo-ins as upskills, while skills in virtual instruction or mindsets around ambiguity may be entirely new competencies in your workforce. Once you've identified the competencies that are missing or need enhancements, dig into each one individually. You may use this bridges and barriers activity as a frame. The first step is to identify a competency. We'll use classroom management as a sample. Next, identify the existing skills, the current baseline of the competency. For example, clear and consistent routines and procedures, or management strategies like proximity, anchor charts, or incentives. Next, identify the newly desired skills, the shifts that are now or will be needed within this competency. For example, expectations for camera use, chats, headphones, or strategies like screen monitoring or digitally accessible facts in the place of anchor charts. Third, identify the barriers, the gaps in resources, mindsets, or knowledge. For example, teachers may be untrained on how to use Zoom or Google Classroom for breakouts, or have mindsets that when on a screen, they need to be talking the whole time. Finally, identify the bridges that need to be formed across every level of teacher experience. For example, how these skills are assessed in teacher interviews, how they're incorporated in teacher onboarding and professional development, and how you elevate high-performing teachers within this competency to share and coach for these practices. We found that using this exercise can help districts better clarify their approach to both reskills and upskills. So, what is one competency that your school or district should reassess? Businessman and futurist Alvin Toffler once said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. As both educators and employers, we have a unique opportunity and responsibility to redefine these skills and develop systems that allow our teachers and support roles to learn, unlearn, and relearn the knowledge, mindsets, and skills necessary to succeed in a new normal.
Hi, I'm Shelby with Education Elements. I'm a former teacher who became a policy researcher who became a consultant. And this means that so much of the guidance that I provide school district leaders and school leaders is grounded in my belief that data play a powerful role in the decisions that we make every day as leaders, and therefore in the educational experiences of students and their families. In this video, I'm going to challenge you to think differently about the data that you are using right now, and maybe the data you're not using right now, and how that information can be used to support teachers through various learning models. I'd like to start with a story about the Space Shuttle Challenger, which I've only recently begun to learn more about that catastrophic event that happened back in 1986. If you're familiar with this event, this is when the space shuttle broke apart about a minute after launching, and all 7 crew members did not survive, including Krista McAuliffe, who would have been the first school teacher in space. It was a terrible event, certainly something that NASA has spent a lot of time studying and working hard not to repeat. But there is a new Netflix special that I recently watched that focuses on the more human side of this event. Of course, the stories behind each of the crew members, but also the human factors that led to that really terrible event. And if you're familiar with the reasons why it occurred, then you know the term O-ring, and you know that that was the specific part of the solid rocket booster, which are the 2 things on the side of the space shuttle that get it into orbit. The O-rings on those boosters are what failed. What I did not know until watching this special, this documentary, is that there was actually a lot of information available to NASA and to the manufacturers of these O-rings to lead them to believe that this might not work and that it might not be a successful launch. For one, every successful launch they had had prior to that one using these solid rocket boosters, they had studied the boosters whenever they came back down to Earth and actually found damage in those O-rings every single time. So there's a lot of evidence that something was happening during launch that was causing damage to those O-rings, and the manufacturer was in the process of still studying and trying to figure out why they were being damaged, and there was some concern that at some point they could completely fail. The other interesting thing about that day is that it was a colder day than any other launch that they had done previously by more than 20 degrees. There was actually a few people at the manufacturer of the solid rocket booster part who voiced concern over that temperature and said that they had not tested their rocket boosters in that temperature before, and actually were specifically worried about the O-rings. And so what happened that day is, that information was presented to the people who made the decision of whether or not to launch, but those individuals had a bias that I think that they did not acknowledge and when they made the decision of what information to prioritize and what information to disregard. And their bias was that they really wanted to launch that day. It had been delayed for multiple days. They had, a president and politicians and a lot of funders who were really pressuring them to get this going. And that bias led them to make decisions about what information mattered and what information didn't. And unfortunately, on that day, the information that they disregarded had a fatal outcome for those astronauts. In education, we make choices about our data too. We decide the kinds of information that are most important and that we're going to use when we make decisions, and we decide which information is less important. And look, as a researcher, I completely believe in the power of that information and that we should be using it to drive our behavior. I think the mistake that we make sometimes, though, is that we fail to recognize our bias and how we make those decisions based on those biases, and not acknowledging them kind of makes us blind to the trade-offs that we're making and the information that we're disregarding and what that means for the decisions that we make. A great example, I think, right now is that our teachers are instructing in a very different world right now and are using completely different tools, different strategies, different models than they have ever used before. But there is a tendency, I think, to still rely on and depend on the data sources and the information that are most comfortable for us. We know what testing data is. We know what attendance data is, and the way to say, like, this student is present and this one is not. But we now are in this world where we have all this additional information, such as technology usage data or engagement data. There's something to be said for perception data, for what kids can tell us about their own experience and what teachers can tell us about how they feel like it's going, and honestly, families and their experiences as well. I think if we don't evolve in the way that we collect and use information, then we're limiting the impact that these innovative learning models can have on our students, and that we're failing to set our teachers up for success if we can't fully inform them on what is working and what isn't. At Education Elements, we have identified 6 essential components of a strong data culture. One of these is holistic, which requires leaders to take a comprehensive view of all of the information available to them and make really intentional decisions about the information that they are going to prioritize. This requires really identifying and neutralizing any biases that might inform those decisions and in turn the behavior that results from those decisions. We believe that is best done through socialization. So here are 3 steps for leading your team through this process. First, perceptions are based on both your preferences, things that you lean into, as well as your ambivalence, areas where you don't have a preference. So have your team reflect individually on both areas where they have preferences and areas where they have ambivalence, and then have them share out with the team and discuss how these collective preferences might shape your perceptions as a team or as a group. Next, design at the margins. Look at those collective perceptions across your team and identify what perspectives might be missing and what information do you have available to you that you can use to fill those gaps, or what kind of new information do you need to collect. Think about how that relates to the current decisions that you make about the information you decide to use to inform your decisions or drive behavior versus those that you decide to not use, and how you might need to adjust those decisions going forward. Finally, put your end user in the center of your focus and think about what information they need in order to be successful, and how should that change how you think about the information you collect and use going forward. I think if the Challenger team would have identified their biases and thought more holistically about the information that they were using that fateful day in 1986, I think they would have acknowledged how the choices they were making in their information usage did not ultimately serve the people who had to make that really important decision about whether or not to launch that day. Similarly, I think if we acknowledge the bias that we have towards the comfortable and the familiar when it comes to collecting and using data, and identify what perspectives might be missing from that conversation, and then you put teachers and students in the front of our focus as the end user of that information, I think it opens up all new possibilities about how we think about supporting teachers through implementing these new, innovative, flexible learning models. Imagine a scenario where teachers are using student feedback or student perception data every day to make decisions about the kinds of instruction that they provide, the content that they cover, the format that they use to share that information, or a dashboard that they have access to that goes beyond just attendance data from is a student present on a Zoom with their camera off, and more so gives them a snapshot of data around the length of time they spent in specific platforms, the number of times they revisited content before they answered a question, or their level of engagement in a really intricate way to give a teacher an idea of where a student is coming from whenever they start their day. So my challenge to you is to take this back to your team and have this conversation. Identify your biases and your perspectives and how that is driving the decisions you're making about what information to use and what information to not use. I think we can get you started on that conversation today with a pause and reflect question. I'd love for you to take a few minutes and brainstorm a list of new information available to you that might not have been available pre-COVID. Take some time to brainstorm that list, and hopefully that can be a jumping off point for you when you have this conversation with your team. so much for watching today. As a quick recap, we talked about the choices we make about the information that we use and the information that we don't use, and how that impacts our decisions and ultimately drives behavior. I hope that this inspires some new ideas for you and your team about how you can continue to support your teachers through implementing new, innovative, flexible learning models.